Welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the egos of all of the people at the table. I'm one of your hosts, DM Neal, aka Jote Maniac.
And I am your other host for the day, DM Chris, aka DM Chris.
Hey!
Never gets old, Neal. Never gets old.
It does not.
Yeah, so we're really excited to be together today because we are talking about monsters, which is always a staple in running any D&D game. But we're not just talking plain old monsters. We're talking about how do we scale monsters either up or down to fit the stories that we're telling, because let's be real, sometimes we want to use a Tarrasque, but we will never get to a level high enough to use a Tarrasque. So how do we scale something like that down? Or if we're never going to get to or if we have a specific enemy that we're thinking about, like we want to have orcs all the way through, how do we scale orcs up to get to a higher level when our players get to level 10 and you would need a billion of them to really do anything against your players? So that's what we're going to talk about today.
So special shout out to Trish, who gave me this idea that I gave to Chris, who loved it and thought we should definitely record. Done. So with that though, we've got nothing else right now. So we're going to head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
Welcome to that segue. Chris and I also decided that one of the things to do to start this conversation or frame the conversation around is to pick some monsters that are historically iconic D&D monsters. That way we can go up or down from there. So the question we want to tackle before that, though, is, and you started to allude to it a little bit, but when and why would we even want to scale monsters up and down? There is a myriad of monsters across every CR that you could imagine, from I think they go down as low as 1/8 to people have gone up to into the 30s for these epic level campaigns.
I mean, they do have some zero ones, like a cat, I think, is 0. So you can, can you imagine scaling a cat up to be like challenge rating 20?
Gosh.
That'd be insane.
Now I need to know.
What are the challenge rating 0 monsters?
Well, I'm going to go to D&D Beyond, who does not support this channel, this podcast. They could if they felt like it, but right now they don't. So, game rules, monsters. Yep, you are correct. The Avatar of Death is a 0. An awakened shrub, a baboon, a badger, a bat. Let's go the other direction. Yep, clear up to 30. The Tarrasque, Tiamat. So there you go. So why would I do these things, Chris?
Yeah, I think my number one reason is because it doesn't limit your story at that point. Like, you can literally tell any story you want. You know, the story that I'm telling now with my players, there is a lich involved. But I guarantee, in order for our players to get to, I think we have 4 players, for them to get to like level 12 or 13, if we're just going by XP, like manage or leveling up instead of milestone, and they're all new players, so like we're taking it really slow getting to levels, and I really wanted to tell a story with a lich in it, they're not going to get up to level 12, 13, 14 that they need to be in order to fight the lich. But the story that I want to tell involves a lich being a part of it. And so I have to work on scaling that lich down in order to still serve the purpose of the story, and still have fun and still make it dangerous without them just like walking in and being like, finger of death, you're dead, because you all have under 100 health points, or one of the characters doing that not being able to save. So I think that's my number one reason, is to not have your story be limited by a CR, so you can tell literally whatever story you want to tell. What about you, Neal? Why do you like the idea of scaling either monsters up or down?
Well, I think that's just it, the narrative choice. I think also just if you or your players have an affinity or a desire to fight, use certain monsters, like, there you go. Like that's more than enough. If someone hasn't fought a dragon, but you're playing in a 5th level game, Like introduce that dragon and make it the dragon as dragony as you can, just to give them that experience. That's more than enough reason to try and decide, I want to take the essence of an ancient and then bring it down to these characters. So I think really just figuring out what your characters love. Maybe they really like fighting goblins, and like you mentioned, or orcs. So you have an entire goblin or orc campaign, and that's okay too. Like whatever, like story element or what your players are drawn to keep them engaged.
Yeah, I think, another reason why I think scaling monsters, especially down, is helpful is because none of us as DMs either run a ton of campaigns that get up to that high of a level. And so just from a simplistic standpoint of cutting things out, or, you don't necessarily have to cut health or AC down, but like if you have a spelled, or if you have a spell caster for some reason that is a big bad guy, or has a lot of actions that they can take, or layer actions, or so many things that just like can compound on top of itself that it gets really complex. Because let's be real, sometimes we show up to a table with every intention to run a super sweet monster, and then we totally botch it because there's so many things, and we think about it afterwards like, oh, that's right. And Aboleth has layer actions, and I forgot about every single one of them, while I was doing this. And so I think just from a standpoint of simplicity, so that you don't have to keep so many things in front of your mind the entire time if you don't have a ton of time to prep, but still want to run a super iconic monster, simplicity is another reason to scale monsters down to be able to fit into your game.
I like it. It's just because you want to. Like, and at the end of the day, that's gonna be one of the biggest driving forces, I think, is that you stumbled upon a piece of art only to find out. I mean, if any of this is on video, I have a hilarious image of like a displacer beast with the name Kitty Whippins, because they're renamed monsters. But like, you could see a displacer beast and think that's amazing, but I want it to start my campaign. Or that's amazing, and we're already 10th level. What am I going to do? So introducing it. And I think the other thing that just came to me is subverting those expectations, because some of the stuff that I was watching to try and prep for this, that was it. Or maybe I was listening to another podcast. I don't know, because I force feed a lot of information into my brain. So then I feel bad because I can't call back to it specifically. But the idea of like early Dungeons and Dragons, like goblins, but then like expert Navy SEAL level goblins all of a sudden for this 10th level campaign. And you didn't necessarily adjust, and this will start to get into how to do this, is like you didn't necessarily just adjust the stat block, you adjusted what they do. And so maybe the single thing that you adjusted was the intelligence, in that they're not just dumb, but they're using their pack tactics, or so maybe it was Cobalt. But the idea that they'll just use everything they have to the best of their ability, and like that might be enough to scale them.
Yes, I think that's interesting, Neal, that you bring that up. How else can we see creatures going? How can we scale them up or down? You kind of alluded to raising, their intelligence a little bit, so they have a bit more smart, so they're not just like running in, Navy. I mean, let's take Navy SEAL goblins, for example. Let's take a regular goblin just for fun.
Yes.
And turn it into super BA Navy SEAL type goblin. Like, what are some things that you would take this very low level CR creature and bring it and boost it up a little bit?
So now you're talking about the intelligence is step one. So then their ability to prepare. And so then that's where you start to get into a dial that I would say you can turn for a monster to make it more difficult to fight, is that you're turning up like the preparation that's taken. And so are they setting up elaborate traps for your party to fall into? Are they doing some sort of crazy pincer moves and attacking from one side and the other to get advantage, or to get flanking if you're using those rules? But the idea that they're just more prepared, and you could, like I said, you could still use that same stat block as it's written, but then you're using some of the tactics, honestly, that the players use against the players.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I can think of is like raising its dexterity a little bit so that it can hide better in a tunnel or whatever it is. You have a couple of them that are hiding out and they want to be really well hidden and they're really well trained. Raise their dexterity so their their hide goes up, and then they get surprise rounds on your players. Surprise rounds do so much more damage to your players because they don't know what's coming. It throws them off guard coming in to a fight, and it keeps them concealed a little bit longer, essentially getting a whole round worth of damage in on your players before your players can get any damage in on them potentially. So that's one thing if we're going to try and make it, you raise it. I don't know what the number is for goblins off the top of my head for its dexterity, but raise it 2 or 3 points. So they get an extra extra modifier in dexterity, and then their hide goes up, and I think that could be one thing that you do for the goblins specifically to make them a little bit more intense.
Yeah, and this one will get a little crunchier than most of our episodes, but just to use 5th edition as a frame of reference, let's say they start at 16, they start at 14, we'll bump them to 16, giving an additional bonus. So their stealth, which they're proficient in, will go up to 7. And now one thing that I wouldn't think to do with goblins is they have nimble escape. So you can use disengage or hide as a bonus action on each of your turns. So then you just shoot and then use nimble escape, and now you're hidden. And you just continue to do that as your tactic to remain hidden and do more damage as well.
Yeah, I think there's the fun in like giving enemies magic items too, in some ways, So could you give goblins boots of spider climbing or something, so that they're up on a cavern instead? It doesn't necessarily raise any of their abilities, but it makes them a little bit more difficult because now they're up on the ceiling. Or give them boots of flying, right? You have an aerial goblin assault, right? That they just have bows, and now all of your users who are melee are like, well, crap, what do I do? You haven't raised any abilities of these goblins, but what you've done is you've significantly impacted the way the battle looks and feels and operates, thus making it more difficult for, say, you have a fighter and a barbarian. If your fighter is not one that has access to magic abilities to shoot up in the air at these creatures, are they going to have to climb a tree and try and hide and then jump out when one flies by? Like, what are they going to have to do at that point? Throw their sword at it? Or maybe a javelin that really only has like 20 feet of range, and then 60, the rest of it is at disadvantage up till 60. And then, like you're significantly impacting the way the battle can go just by giving it not anything that's going to overpower your players necessarily. Like they might want boots of flying, which is a cool thing, but like it's a cool thing, but you're probably not going to do that when they're level 1. We're talking about bumping these creatures up when your players already have access to some magic items if they want to. Or maybe you just have 1 or 2 of the goblins have boots of flying, so your whole party isn't now just a flying party of death upon every other creature.
Yeah, and the other way to go about that is potions, because then you're not going to give that out. I mean, that sounds mean, but it's not, because you don't want to break that economy of scale either, because then you've given too much and now you have to constantly turning that dial up on your side just to make it engaging for the players. But so then you give a potion of fly. And did they all have a potion of fly? I don't know. Also, this is going to throw back to way, way, way old. So in original EverQuest, there was an NPC called Fippy Darkpaw. It was basically like this rando who would shout threats and potentially go attack a town. What you could do is you could give Fippy an amazing weapon, and then they would go destroy that town in EverQuest. There you go. That's just immediately what it made me think of, is this random goblin that has this like end all be all artifact level weapon for reasons unknown.
Or threatens to, but actually has it somewhere.
Yeah, just destroying absolutely everyone. So one of the things that we haven't talked about and I would like to talk about so that we say that it's not necessarily the best idea, is the number of goblins that you could throw at your players is always an option. But I don't necessarily think it's a great option, because at that point, like it may just make the combat longer, and that's not necessarily more fun or more interesting for you or your players, especially like managing that on your side as the DM of like, okay, I got to keep track of the hit points of 20 goblins and like, did the dice like me?
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh, cool, I got a lot more 20s, and that's not great.
There's always the idea of waves that you could bring in too, like staggering them a little bit, saying goblins in a different room heard this, right? And they are 100 feet away. It's going to take them 2 or 3 rounds to get here. And so by that time, 3 or 4 goblins have died. Now 5 more enter into the battle, and it's made it that much more dangerous for them. You know, one of the things I think is super easy and I'll say it, but then I want to have a little bit of a dialogue with you because the episode would be real boring, because probably everybody knows that this is a super easy way to bump up challenge rating, Neal, is to add more health or to add more AC in some way. Neal, question for you. Which would you rather do for a character or for a creature? Would you rather bump its health or bump its AC? Which would you be more inclined to do first?
Okay, so this is a gaming term that it immediately made me think of, because for many, many years, when I played World of Warcraft, I always played a tank. That's just, and it always, like, that's my video game mentality takes me to those levels.
I was awful at tanking. Every single time we would do a raid or a dungeon, people were like, "You're not drawing enough attention." I'm like, I'm a bear druid, man. I'm trying.
Yeah. And so that, like I was doing like max level raiding as a tank and things like that. So, and then I also, like, my go-to is a dwarven cleric. So like that's always where I've gone. So effective health is why we put these two together, because armor class and hit points together make your effective health, because if you're not hit, you're still alive. Even if you had 1 hit point, but they can't hit you, then you live longer. So my thing is actually to turn up armor class is a better way to go, because then it may make it harder to hit, but then once that hit happens, it is more effective.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say too, is to turn up the AC first. Turn it up to 11, you know, because it does make it that much harder to hit. Whereas I think for the 1 point of AC, and I'm sure somebody's done the mathematics out there, like if you how to, and maybe we can find something like this and link it if we do find it, but like what is essentially the effective health of, for every AC, how much health would you have to add to a character, you know? I mean, in some ways it is more fun for your players to hit things over and over and over and over again. At the same time, it's really fun for your players when they struggle and then they finally get the hit in. You know, raising something from a 15 to a 16 makes it that much more difficult. You know, and the thing is too, I mean, this is kind of, some people might call it cheating, but if a battle ends really quickly, say you do bump the AC up and players still hit it, you can always add health later on in the battle. You can't always go, well, everybody's figured out the AC is 16, and now I've bumped it to 17. Everybody's going to be like, whoa, hang on a second. What just happened here? That's not cool. I mean, you can probably come up with some reason why it's happened, but I tend to agree with you. I think raising the AC is probably my go-to first step for increasing a challenge for our players.
Yeah. And the other thing is looking at HP as a range, but yeah, it's not really the dial to turn that much either, because like having a battle go a little bit longer, like is that interesting? Is that fun? I don't know, but unless there is like a specific reason you wanted to do a certain move, or there's like a narrative point that you needed to make in like that next round somehow. But yeah, if you had like a specific narrative point, like what was keeping you from making that narrative point prior to now? Like what is that extra round of health, or 2 rounds of health? And then if you're turning both dials, now we kind of have like, then it's just this slog that's not that interesting either.
So here's an interesting thought too, Neil, that I would love your thoughts on. So one of the things that I've done in the past to keep my players a little in the dark on characters and creatures is to effectively have them have different AC for each creature. So if you have 4 orcs, one might have a 14, one might have a 17. Giving them different regular armor could do that as well as they go into a battle, instead of just saying like, oh, they all look the same, but one has a 17 AC instead. You know, that could be fun for a battle, because it just keeps your players guessing a little bit. You know, if you have waves on top of that with different creatures coming in that are now different ACs for each one as well, it might be a little bit more tricky. Like you might have to keep track a little bit more. But that's always something fun to do for your battles as well, to keep your players guessing.
Yeah, the other thing that made me think of, which we've alluded to before, talking about the idea of the goblins using nimble escape, is, and this is probably the one dial that I would say is the most interesting. I hate to say most effective, because certainly like I don't know. I guess our only real goal here with the episode, in my opinion, is to give tools that you can try at your table to see if they work for you and your table. That is the best I can say about anything that we've said thus far, because some of these things won't work. Like they won't work for you. They won't work for your table. They won't be interesting, but some of them will 100% be exactly what you needed. So one of the things that I would say is the action economy. Like that's where you need to play and have the most fun, because now I took the goblin and I gave it bonus actions, or I gave it really interesting reactions that like fit outside of the norm. Like, do I have this all, like are these all in goblins, or is it a mix of both? I mean, going with the Navy SEAL idea. So we have some that are in the back that are using their bonus action to hide. But what if when you're up close, there's kind of a goblin that uses their reaction to leap? And so then they're going to stab you because you stabbed at them, and they don't care about the consequences that happen because of that.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I think you could give to a lot of different creatures, like I have a group of gnolls that regularly re-show up to our players while they're in this jungle area, and they have this ability called Rampage, where when a gnoll reduces a creature to 0 hit points with a melee attack on its turn, the gnoll can take a bonus action to move up to half of its speed and make a bite attack against creatures. So, like, could you give creatures like goblins reword that to in some way, or just give them Rampage and say that they are just bloodthirsty, hungry, you know, creatures? Instead of taking a bite attack, they get a swing with their scimitar instead, you know? Like the Gnoll Pack Lord has the ability to Insight Rampage. So in your group of goblins, like they might not have this, but you could now create a leader who might be a little bit buffed in some way, and you say they get Insight Rampage, which is recharge on a 5 or a 6. One creature the goblin can see within 30 feet of it can use its reaction to make a melee attack if it can hear the goblin that has just let out this guttural battle cry, or they have a horn with them, you know, that they blow instead, and now they Insight Rampage in this one goblin that's with them, you know? Like, could that be taking and stealing different action economy, if that's the word we're going to use for it, things that other creatures have, and buffing them onto a creature that might not have that? That's another thing that you could do to help kind of up the ante a little bit for some of these creatures, to make them a little bit more difficult as the adventure goes along and your players get more and more dangerous to the world around them.
The other thing was, and you had mentioned it, or I mean, basically it comes out of something you have already said, is adding, well, and I guess it's combined with something I already said, but it's adding layer actions. Did these goblins prepare? Like, I know a layer action sounds, it's a dragon layer and they're on their horde. There's these special things they could do, but it could also just be that they have one thing that they can do. And even and again, it's getting a little bit more crunchy, but the idea that like you have a layer action and you can't use the same layer action twice in a row. So if you gave this group of goblins one layer action, mechanically you could say they could only do it every other round. But come initiative 20, is there like a swinging log? I don't know. Like, is that cool? Maybe, but the idea that they could do something every other round because they have prepared to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's an interesting idea of like adding traps in as layer actions. Like, could there be, you have a battle map drawn out. There's specific squares that have a pit trap underneath them. And as a layer action, one of the goblins can pull a lever that he's standing next to. A marksman can do all of his abilities, but then layer action is, if you have like a group layer action, let's say, they pull the lever that's next to them, your players fall down into a pit of spikes that are below them because that one player was on top of that pit spike the entire time. It's not something that will recharge, but it's like a usable layer action that now is gone. It was one they prepared for.
Yeah.
Now it's gone. And we move on from there. Like those sorts of things can make an encounter. And that's kind of encounter management, I guess, in a way, not necessarily leveling up a creature, but we're kind of mixing both encounter building and goblin, which makes an entire encounter more difficult than maybe just the creature being buffed in some way.
Yes. So this feels almost Gymnastics like, but is there a monster on? So we found a few articles and just digging around on ye old interwebs to find what are iconic Dungeons and Dragons monsters. And is there one that you have? I mean, you alluded to the Tarask, but essentially that you would want to scale up or scale down.
Yeah, I think one that I'm doing already is a Lich. So that would be a little bit of a cop-out because I've always wanted to run a Lich, but have never had a player get that far before, or players get that far before to be able to do it. So one that I want to pick is the Aboleth because it's one that like I think is an iconic monster, but often gets overlooked, I think, for different ones because it is like a water creature. Sometimes people don't know how to necessarily use water creatures exactly that well because most of our players are not in the water regularly, or if it does happen, they're on a boat or whatever it is. So, so let's pick the Aboleth. Let's figure out how do we scale. We'll probably have to scale. Let's say we have a smaller group of players, a lower level group of players, and we want to scale an Aboleth down to a lower challenge rating for our players to be able to encounter this iconic monster and not just die right away. So, Neal, what's one thing, if you have it up, what's one thing that you might change about an Aboleth to make it easier? Besides health, we'll take health. That will just be an automatic. Yeah. Like you could cut health in half or take 50 points off from its health. But let's talk a little bit grittier. What are some things that you would change?
Enslave, it's out. It's gone.
Yeah.
Because that's one that just, I mean, it messes up any party at any level. So to turn that dial down, taking away the enslaved so that the person is not charmed, that's really going to help out with keeping, again, now, a lot of ways we're talking about that action economy. That's really, like I said, that for me, that's the place I would have the most interesting fun playing with and turning dials. So I've turned that dial in leaving it more in the terms of the player because now they all still, I mean, that's a big, oh my gosh, that is not, I hate my brain sometimes. It made me think of the glorious movie that is one of my favorites of all time, Dodgeball.
Nobody makes me bleed my own blood.
Dodge, dip, duck, dive, and dodge. But that swing of like, okay, so you've got so many players on one side and so many players on the other. But the idea that, okay, so not only do they have one less, I have one more. Like, so then taking that out, that's my number one.
Yeah, I think, you could also, if you don't want to take Enslave all the way out, you could lower its DC, its check in order for somebody to fail. Or there's like, the person who takes damage has to repeat the saving throw. You could take the repeating the saving throw and just say when a character takes damage, it breaks. So there's like little tweaks to that you can make if you don't want to take it out all the way. But I agree with you 100%. Like taking Slave out, totally a different ball game because it's literally the Aboleth versus everybody at that point. I think so. Some of the obvious things is you could lower damage, the number of dice that are thrown. You could do that. Seems like a little bit of a cop out. I would take away one of its multi-attacks. So instead of doing 3, it just does 2 now instead with its tails. So that's a really easy one to take out in order for just less damage to be done overall to the characters. Add that in with hit points being gone. You've now got a lower CR challenge rating Aboleth for your players to come up against. Anything else you would want to change, Neal?
So why, Chris? Why am I putting this lower level Aboleth in there?
I mean, one of the easy things you could say is that it's just a younger Aboleth from all the older ones. It hasn't learned everything yet, and it's to enhance the storytelling that your players get to enjoy. They get to enjoy this crazy looking creature that can do weird things, can probe their mind, find out all of these fears that they have. And at the end of it, they had to kill it. And inside of it, they find somebody who had died and a magic item they're looking for that continues them on a quest. There you go.
And I also like the idea that if there's any character that has telepathy or anything close or divination or something along those lines, what could you feed back? So you could have that introduction earlier into the campaign. And is it that there's this insidious Aboleth run plot where they've finally grown enough strength deep within the ocean and they're moving forward to try and take over more of the world? I don't know. So yeah, I like that. So I looked up another one that I was like, oh, this would be fun. And I guess I just didn't realize, I just have too much knowledge and time with it, but the Rust Monster is only a CR 1/2.
Yeah, which is crazy.
I don't know what to do with that. So apparently we're going to go the other direction. And we're going to turn this up. So how are we going to take a Rust Monster and make it even more terrifying for our higher level group?
I was just looking on D&D Beyond and in Prince of the Apocalypse, they have a Rust Monster pit where your players fall into it and there's rust monsters in there. Like,
now
that sounds
we're talking.
awful. Unless they don't have any rust on them, then they're fine. One thing that the Rust Monster you can do is you can turn the dexterity or the DC of 11 for a dexterity saving throw against being touched by the antenna. You could turn that up to like 13 instead. Because when a Rust Monster touches metal, it like erodes like a 1 square foot or something like that. I can't remember what it is, but I mean, that becomes significantly harder to beat because now it's also lowering the AC of your players, subsequently making them easier to hit, changing the tactics that they have to use for that battle overall. So that would be one thing. I mean, to turn it up a little bit, not taking a Rust Monster from 1.5 to like 10 on the challenge rating.
Yeah.
But like just bumping it up a little bit more and bringing your players and humbling them a little bit by turning its antenna DC up a little bit.
Yeah. And it made me, I mean, one of the ways that I think of often is like you have that dragon progression. So I mean, that is kind of a built-in feature of Dungeons and Dragons is to look at like what is a wormling compared to an ancient and the progression through that. So then it made me think of like what is an older or I don't know that I want to say ancient, but an older Rust Monster. I would definitely turn up the armor class because even narratively and thematically that makes sense to me because they are drawing in that power. So then the other thing is like in their advanced age, are they more adept at destroying magic? Obviously that's terrifying. And I would hate to do irreparable damage to a player, or rather, maybe it may hurt my player forever and they can never get over it, but irreparable damage to a character's equipment, without again, first off, if this is the route I'm going, I'm signaling that super hard that after X number of things that's a potential, but that they're later talk about ways to renew that magic and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the ability to destroy magic is very interesting.
Yeah, because that is one thing that it says is non-magical weapons made of metal are the ones that degrade. But now you have a rust monster that's older and that can wear through that. Like, ugh.
Yeah.
Be careful with that +1/+1 sword that also creates lightning when it strikes something, you know.
Mm-hmm.
That was one thing that I was going to say too, is like you could almost create a rust monster that the more it gets hit by metal things, the more damage it does. So it does a 1d8 +1 bite attack. It gets hit by a weapon, it now does 1d8 +2 piercing damage. It's not a huge amount of damage extra, but every time it ingests or erodes some metal, it adds to them in some way, shape, or form and makes them a little bit more dangerous. Not a ton, but a little bit. But I mean, you bump it up with some higher hit points as well. This might be one time to add hit points to make it progressively get harder and harder. Could become a really dangerous rust monster.
Yeah. So here's another idea that I had that you started to go towards, and I thought you were going one direction. You went a different one. It was great. But the idea of, okay, so they destroyed this magical sword of lightning. So what if it's that oh my gosh, this is just a terrifying road I'm going down. What if it's that they ate a ring of invisibility? And now that's the ability that they have. Like they can turn invisible. Or what if it's a ring of regeneration? And so then again, now you also have that element that like if the players are willing, that like they find that item as well.
Yeah.
So afterwards.
Yeah.
But then like whatever this older rust monster has inside of it, it also has those same abilities. Gosh, the ring of spell storing. Like what's in there? Like did they like all of a sudden just boom, this fireball erupts from this rust monster? I don't know. But this is definitely all these like fun dials that we can turn up again.
Yeah. Well, I think with the antenna ability too, you could say any metal that it does eat, not from being hit. So it might have this ability when it gets hit, it gains more damage. But if it erodes something like a shield or armor or anything metal around it, it now regenerates hit points instead. So every time it eats something, it regenerates, or erodes something, it regenerates 5 health points, you know? Could be something that players are like, why is this little thing like we're like level 1 right now and this thing is not dying. It's one thing. Why is that? Well, because it's regaining health points every time it corrodes some metal. And it also has the spell storing inside of it, and they all blow up at level 1 because it has fireball in there. That could be fun.
Ring of shooting stars. Then it just does a bunch of ball lightning or actual shooting stars. Fantastic. Great ideas. Okay. So the one thing that I don't know what we're going to do to talk about is homework for people to go check out. This one doesn't necessarily fall as much into the like, go watch this show. I lied. Go watch Pokemon. Done.
Evolutions, baby.
Digimon?
Digimon, digital monsters.
Mm-hmm. So those are potentially ways that you could do it. The other would be to actually go whatever role playing game you're playing. Maybe they already have examples built in to figure out what the designers of a game did when turning things up and down. So the idea that again, that progression of Wormling to Ancient, like you can see specific CR points, and yeah. So those are my 2 thoughts real quick. Chris, did you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, YouTube is chock full of other people that have talked about this as well. So you can go and watch anybody. Like I just did a quick YouTube search. Like the DM Layer has something, Dawn Forged Cast, Nerdarchy. Like there's a whole bunch of them out there. I think really the homework is just try it. Like there's really no other way to do it than to try it. Like if you have an upcoming battle, you know, one of the things that I'm doing right now is there's a recurring group of gnolls that keeps coming back to plague our party over and over again when they're in the jungle. They've just been killing them. They haven't figured out that there's a story element to why they're doing it. But as they've gotten bigger in level, the gnolls have also had to get bigger in level. So maybe think about what's one recurring creature that your players have come up against, and just work on tweaking it so that it can come back again and keep trailing them wherever it is that they're going as they get higher and higher in level.
Yeah, I absolutely love the idea that even if you're not trying to scale something, you have the opportunity in that next battle to try scaling something. That you like you I'm saying that like you don't have the narrative motivation right now. Maybe you don't have the art that inspired you. You don't have a monster that your players really want to battle. You're just like, I'll try it. And so then my thought was like, okay, so the goblins are showing up. What if I say that all of them have shields? And so now I've chosen to give every goblin +2 AC. What does that look like? I don't know. But yeah, go and do Dungeon Master away.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is just, I think you're right. Like, just change the armor that creatures are wearing. See how it feels. See how it looks. Like, that's a super easy homework thing to mess around with. And it might give you fun ideas of other things to tweak.
Awesome. Well, hey, Chris, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Neal, thanks for having me.
I just want to thank Chris again for coming on and spending some time here at the dungeon. Wait a minute, that's not how this works. But if you wanted to get a hold of us and tell us about how you've been scaling monsters, the dials that you've been turning, and the ways that it's worked or not worked, you can always get a hold of us and email us at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com.
If you would like to show us some appreciation for the show, you can go to iTunes or whatever podcast catcher you use and leave a 5-star review or whatever the subsequent highest review is on that podcast. You can find us on Twitter at DMS_block. That's DM's block. Give us a follow. Tell us what you liked about this episode when it is live. And you can like us on Facebook as well at Dungeon Master Block.
As always, the Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network, where you can check out other shows like DM Nastics, Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, Detentions and Dragons, and more.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God,
killing characters,
and lowering the egos of all of the people at your table. Have a great night, everyone.
And keep on Dungeon Mastering.